Okay, can you all hear me? All right, good. All right. Thanks for having me. I've been in and out of Atlanta a number of times, especially when I was living in Tallahassee. I've never been to this facility, however, which has a rich heritage that goes back to the Sweet Auburn branch of the Atlanta Public Library, which I'll talk about in a little bit. My wife is currently dangling her toes in the Atlantic Ocean with our daughter up in Raleigh, North Carolina, but she expresses her regret at not being here. I will be meeting with her tomorrow evening as I go on this book tour. This is about the 12th of a 20-city book tour, and all hotels are now looking alike to me. Meals are kind of the same way, too. Okay, the desegregation of public libraries in the Jim Crow South, civil rights and local activism. This is Albany, Georgia, August 1962.
Besides segregated lunch counters and parks, another target is the public library, where Negroes must enter through the basement and are not allowed to browse.
You should have been down there to see those students this afternoon at that library. Now when the kids went down, the library was open. So they crowded to the entrance and they stood there for a minute, and then they kneeled down and sung some songs. And then they prayed. They knew what they were doing, and they meant what they were doing from the depths of their heart. In the church today, we got up, just like you said here, the kids discussed it. It was their own decision. Nobody pushed them into it. And they didn't walk to the paddy wagon. They were limp.
Notice those are all teenage kids. Before civil rights activities in the 1960s, the public library experiences of Southern Black Americans were varied. The vast majority had none. Eliza Atkins Gleason's 1940 study of public library services to Southern blacks showed that only 12% of Southern public libraries provided some kind of services to blacks. 44% of whites in Southern states had access to public library services. Only 21% of blacks did. And in the few libraries that did provide blacks services, experiences were often humiliating. In the 1920s, a 19-year-old Richard Wright wanted access to the Memphis Public Library collections. He had read articles in the Chicago Defender reporting Northern blacks could not only go into public libraries, they could also check out any book that they wanted. Like most Southern libraries, however, at the Memphis Public, they were not allowed to patronize its shelves any more than they were the parks and the playgrounds of the city, except to get books for white people. Wright plotted. One morning, he approached a fellow worker. "I want to ask you a favor," he whispered. "What is it?" "I can't get books from the library. I wonder if you'd let me use your card." The white man balked. "You're not trying to get me in trouble, are you, boy?" When asked what he wanted to read, Wright named journalist scholar H.L. Mencken. Eventually, the man agreed to the ploy, but only after pledging Wright to secrecy. One day thereafter, he gave Wright his wife's library card. Wright wrote in his autobiography, "That afternoon, I addressed myself to forging a note. 'Dear Madam, will you please let this nigger boy,' I used the word nigger to make the librarian feel I couldn't possibly be the author of the note, 'have some books by H.L. Mencken.' Wright then describes what happened next. I entered the library as I had always done, went on errands for whites, but I felt that I would somehow slip up and betray myself. I doffed my hat, stood a respectful distance from the desk, looked as unbookish as possible, and waited for the white patrons to be taken care of. When the desk was clear of people, I still waited. The white librarian looked at me. 'What do you want, boy?' As though I didn't possess the power of speech, I stepped forward and simply handed her the forged note, not parting my lips. 'What books by Mencken does she want?' she asked. 'I don't know, ma'am,' I said, avoiding her eyes. 'You're not using these books, are you?' she asked pointedly. 'Oh, no, ma'am, I can't read.' The ploy worked. The librarian delivered 2 Mencken books. Outside the library, Wright wrapped them in a newspaper, in part to protect these treasures, in part because he knew white people might question his reading if they saw him with 2 books by H.L. Mencken. But there was another kind of experience, one less frequent but much more pleasant. In the 1930s at the Atlanta Public Library's Sweet Auburn branch, one of the few public places in this segregated city where blacks were welcome and safe, librarian Annie Waters hosted discussion groups focused on Mahatma Gandhi. To ground these discussions, Waters purchased a number of books. Among their most devoted readers was a young Martin Luther King Jr., who, Waters said, came to the library many times during the week. She later recalled their interactions, which not only showed King's reading interest, but also manifested the value of library as place in Atlanta's black community. He'd walk up to the desk and look me straight in the eye. "Hello, Martin Luther," she'd respond, always calling him by his first and middle names. "What's on your mind?" "Oh, nothing particularly." For Waters, that was a cue that King had learned a new big word, and between them, they then had a conversation in which King used the word repeatedly, and Waters corrected him when he didn't. Another game they played involved poetry. Again, King would stand by the desk, waiting. "What's on your mind, Martin Luther?" Waters would ask. "For I dipped into the future, far as the human eye could see," he responded. Waters immediately recognized the Tennyson poem and finished the verse, saw the vision of the world and all the wonder that would be. The Gandhi collection presented a problem, however, because King was too young to check out adult books on his children's card. To solve it, Waters told him to ask his father to come and get a library card, and he could check the books out on his father's card. Waters notes, "And that's how I made it possible for Martin Luther to read those books on Gandhi. And he read every one of those books that we had." In many southern cities, King would not have had such access. But the Supreme Court 1954 Brown versus the Board of Education decision, the Montgomery bus boycotts of 1955-56, the forced desegregation of Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957, and the Greensboro, North Carolina lunch counter sit-ins in early 1960 inspired young blacks to directly challenge the Jim Crow South, including its Jim Crow public libraries. Over his Christmas break in late 1959, for example, University of Illinois freshman Jesse Jackson went to the McBee Avenue Colored Branch in his hometown of Greenville, South Carolina. Because he couldn't find titles he was looking for, the librarian wrote a note and sent him to the White Main Library downtown. When Jackson got there and walked through the rear entrance, several policemen were talking to the librarian. She looked at his note and remarked, "It'll take at least 6 days to get these titles." "6 days," Jackson responded. "Couldn't I just go back on the shelves and look for them where nobody else would see me?" "You cannot have the books now. That's the way it is." "You heard what she said," growled one policeman. Jackson stormed out the library's rear door, walked to the front of the building, and looked up. I just stared up at that Greenville Public Library, and tears came to my eyes. I said to myself, that thing says public, and my father's a veteran and pays taxes. Angry and humiliated, he decided to take action. When I get back home this summer, he said, I'm going to use that library. During Jackson's spring semester, however, local black high school students preempted him. On March 8, 1960, little over a month after the Greensboro lunch counter sit-ins, 20 entered the library, milled about the stacks, and read at tables. Rather than serve them, officials closed the library for the day. 8 days later, 7 students returned. This time they were arrested for disorderly conduct, but never brought to trial. That summer, while reports of sit-ins and demonstrations across the South filled newspaper columns, Jackson and 5 other students showed up on the public library steps, whereupon police told them they'd be arrested if they entered the building. And so, Jackson later recalled, we left. When Jackson returned to his neighborhood and proudly told his clergyman his group had successfully avoided arrest, the clergyman responded, "But that's the point." Jackson understood what he meant. 2 days later, he became part of a group of 8 neatly dressed, mostly college students who entered the library and staged a 40-minute sit-in. The poster right in front of me has a photograph from the local Greenville, South Carolina newspaper, and you can see Jesse Jackson walking right towards you as they took a photograph of them ambling towards the library. When they refused to leave after the library director asked them, the director called police. All were arrested for disorderly conduct, held for 45 minutes, and released on bail paid by Jackson's clergyman. The Greenville News identified all 8 and published their photos. It also found library protests contemptible. You can see Jackson is in the upper left-hand row. The white people of Greenville County are not going to pay additional taxes to support an expanded institution which is going to be subjected to constant harassment simply because the equal facilities happen to be segregated. The library incidents helped spark other demonstrations by black youth at local lunch counters, swimming pools, and parks that summer. On July 28, the NAACP filed suit in federal court to desegregate the Greenville Public Library. A month later, the city council voted to close the main library and the black branch until further notice. The mayor commented, "The efforts made by a few Negroes to use the white library will now deprive white and Negro citizens of the benefit of a library." The local newspaper supported the move and worried about what it called an influx of mixed races and the renewal of strife that integration of the library would bring. 10 days later, a federal district judge threw out the lawsuit, arguing that plaintiffs had no case since the library was no longer open. As numerous complaints from whites and blacks about the closed library came in, however, the mayor announced he'd seek a meeting with the library board and the city council to consider the library's future. Then, 3 days later, and without prior announcement, all city libraries opened. The city libraries will be operated for the benefit of any citizen having a legitimate need for the libraries and their facilities, stated the mayor. Although the mayor did not say the library was now integrated, the newspaper noted the inference was unmistakable. And while it welcomed the action, it also forewarned, there is no cause for anyone to either gloat or complain that an integration breakthrough has occurred. Contacts and associations in the library are brief and lacking in the intimacy which exists in parks, swimming pools, and schools. Each patron goes about his business in the same way as he does at the bank, the post office, or on the public bus. And in Mississippi, shortly after she opened the Jackson Public Library on March 27, 1961, acting director Francis French was asked by reporters from the United Press International and the New Orleans Times-Picayune if she was aware a group of black students was coming to the library that day. She was not, she said, but after the reporters left, she immediately phoned the police. Contact us when students arrive, they responded. Unbeknownst to French, while she was talking to police, 9 nearby Tougaloo Southern Christian College students, 4 women and 5 men and all NAACP members, were preparing for Mississippi's first sit-in demonstration. NAAC mentors told all to dress well, sit quietly in the library, and avoid violence at all costs. The 4 women wore dresses, the men dressed shirts and ties, some added sport coats. First, they visited the Black George Washington Carver branch and requested books they knew were not there. At about 11 a.m., they walked to the main library. I went into the library and I stood by the card catalog. You all remember what a card catalog is, right? Yeah, okay. And was thumbing through it, Ethel Sawyer later recalled. After I didn't see the title of the book I wanted, I went over and sat at one of the tables, and I had other textbooks with me until I read, up until the time I was interrupted. Albert Lassiter deliberately stood in front of the card catalog with a clear view of the front door. I had seen what a billy club could do to a guy's head, so I positioned myself so I could see the blows coming. I didn't want to get a blind shot. 10 minutes passed. During that time, the librarian called the local police, then approached the students. "May I help you?" "We're doing research," they responded. She suggested they visit one of the 2 black branches. Immediately thereafter, a group of policemen and plainclothesmen came in and told the students to get up and get out of the library. But nobody moved, Sawyer said. About a minute later, the chief of police told them they were under arrest. 6 officers placed all the students in squad cars and at the station charged them with breach of the peace because they failed to leave the library when ordered. These are the students being conducted out of the library by police. And the next slide is actually a video the local TV station took of the whole procedure. I'll try to narrate it a little bit. It's a silent video. That's the front of the Jackson Public Library. And here are the students inside. There's the front cover of the book. That's Sam Bradford. He's still alive. You could see the media in the background. They're now being arrested. The tall guy is Albert Lassiter, the one in front of the card catalog. And off they go to jail. Because the students had notified the press in advance, reporters were able to capture the events in photographs and stories. And that's the mugshots of the Tougaloo Nine. In jail that evening, Tougaloo students worried. Reflecting back on Emmett Till, the history of lynching connected with Mississippi, Joseph Jackson later recalled, "The later it got that night, I was in fear of my life." He began rehearsing what he'd say if the Ku Klux Klan came in for them. "Please, Mr. Klansman, don't hang me. I have a wife and 2 little children in Memphis, Tennessee, and if you release me this night, I promise you I will never, ever come back here to Jackson, Mississippi and violate your Jim Crow laws." "Well, that sounds very good," one of his colleagues responded, "but you know what the Klansman would say? Nigger, you should have thought of that before you entered our segregated public library." Several days later, students were taken to the courthouse to be tried, and again, reporters were ready. So were 100 supporters who cheered what were now referred to as the Tougaloo Nine. When the crowd began to applaud the 9 students as they arrived for their trial, the police chief yelled, "That's it, move them out, get them." Police then set upon the crowd with nightsticks and dogs as once again reporters captured the event with cameras snapping. In the melee, civil rights activist and NAACP representative Medgar Evers and several women and children were beaten. 2 men were bitten by the dogs, and an 81-year-old man suffered a broken arm when police beat him with a club. That evening, 1,500 people attended a mass meeting to protest police brutality. One headline quoted a telegram sent by the NAACP, "Call off the dogs, slavery is over." White segregationists defaulted to their canned response. In his daily column, a Jackson newspaper staff writer complained, A quiet community has been invaded by rabble-rousers stirring up hate between the races, and following are the publicity media feeding an integrated North the choicest morsels from the Mississippi carcass. The Negro who has so long held the guiding and helping hand of the white, he warned, may lose that hand as he climbs the back of his benefactor and teacher to shout in halls where he is not welcome. Amid the din, the Tougaloo Nine went to trial. They were quickly found guilty of breach of the peace. Each student was fined $100, their 30-day sentences suspended on condition they participate in no further demonstrations. None of the students testified, but a police captain said they'd been arrested because their presence at the library could have caused trouble. Medgar Evers later argued that the brutality exercised on those black supporters set in motion the broader desegregation activities in Mississippi. On January 12, 1962, the NAACP filed a class action lawsuit, and 5 months later, a federal judge ordered the Jackson Public Library to desegregate. In Alabama, Birmingham's public library desegregated differently. In June 1962, black teenager Lola Hendricks entered the main library to request a book. Librarians refused to serve her, they said, because she was black. They advised her to use one of the two colored branches and informed her that if the book she requested was not part of their collections, she could request branch librarians to obtain the book from the main library. Next month, Hendricks and others filed suit in federal court to desegregate the Birmingham Public Library and all public buildings. Anxious about the national reputation Commissioner of Public Safety Eugene Bull Connor earned for their city, many activists referred to Birmingham as Bombingham in those days. Moderate white citizens turned him out of office in early 1963, the same time Hendricks and fellow litigants awaited a decision on their suit. Shortly thereafter, Miles College students conducted sit-ins at 4 downtown lunch counters. Still in office, Connors responded with billy clubs and police dogs that was captured on national media. Days later, Southern Christian Leadership Council Executive Director Wyatt Walker recruited fair-skinned Adine Deanie Drew to pass as white and case the downtown library to prepare for a public library sit-in. Attired like a middle-class white in blue and white silk dress and hat, she entered the library unhindered, walked through the reading rooms and stacks, and after noting all entrances and exits, left the building to call Walker from a payphone across the street. The experience was so traumatic, she later recalled, she had to look down at my feet and tell them to keep walking. On April 9, she and several other black students entered the library and sat reading at desks undisturbed. Whites stared but said nothing. When librarians took no action, students left quietly. Disappointed they'd provoked no incident, Walker planned a second sit-in the next day. He told 12 students to approach the library that afternoon at the same time, but from different directions, and asked Shirley Millender to speak for the group once they got inside. As they approached the library, 2 men came up to Millender. I was really scared that day, he later recalled, hoping if violence occurred, the media would be there to photograph the incidents. He was unaware the 2 men were newspaper reporters Walker had tipped. They followed him into the library, and as the other students gathered, Millender spoke to the librarians at the circulation desk, where he asked to join the library. Birmingham had a library for Negroes, the librarian said. Millender should go there. Thereafter, Millender and the librarian had quite a little skirmish in terms of rhetoric, he later recalled, and when finished, Millender sat at a desk with several other students. Police came, but after several phone calls and much muffled conversation, refused to arrest them. 45 minutes later, students left, voluntarily and without incident or disturbance, the library director later told his board, despite the fact that they had to walk through a crowd of young whites, some of whom uttered remarks like, "It stinks in here," and "Why don't you go home?" We were there to get arrested, Millender said, and when that didn't happen, they saw no purpose in staying. At a quickly assembled board meeting the next day, the library director wanted board approval of his actions the previous day and guidance for what he perceived would be inevitable future sit-ins. The board discussed alternatives, and although it rejected any use of the library for sit-in demonstrations, it approved the director's actions and unanimously passed a resolution that no persons be excluded from the use of the public library facilities because of race. Their decision came the day before Martin Luther King and 132 other protesters were arrested by Bull Connor for violating an injunction preventing them from staging demonstrations. That same day, 25 black young people were arrested, 3 for sitting in at a local restaurant and 9 for frequenting the counter at a bakery. In subsequent weeks, millions of television viewers across the country watched visual images of Connor's minions using fire hoses and police dogs on black demonstrators. While incarcerated, King wrote his famous letter from the Birmingham jail. Then, on September 15, the nation was shocked when 4 adolescent black girls attending Sunday school died in the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. By quietly desegregating in the midst of a violent summer, the Birmingham Public Library actually functioned as a lone mediating site for facilitating racial reconciliation. Perhaps board members approved the effort to counter the national image of violence Connor helped create for their city. Perhaps they feared cameras capturing and the national news media reporting on similar violence in their library. At a July board meeting, the library director reported a distinct increase in the number of blacks using the main library facilities, and particularly the formerly white branch closest to the black neighborhood. When the director testified in court in December, he reported the Birmingham Public Library was an integrated institution. The media, national and local, largely ignored the library in its coverage. 1963 was a turning point in the civil rights movement. By the end of the year, there'd been 930 protests in 11 southern states that led to 20,000 arrests, 35 bombings, and 10 deaths. The violence on public display led President John F. Kennedy to step away from the tepid position he showed in the first 2 years of his administration. He not only condemned the violence publicly, he also proposed significant legislation. Months later, Kennedy was assassinated, and less than 8 months after that, his successor, Lyndon Johnson, shepherded through Congress the 1964 Civil Rights Act. 3 months prior to Kennedy's assassination, the March on Washington certified Martin Luther King Jr. as the movement's single most important leader. Americans, certainly the white keepers of the Jim Crow system, but also black people who had never marched or protested against segregation, looked to King as the civil rights leader, someone who spoke on behalf of all black people. King drew increased attention from the national media, but because he seldom participated in public library desegregation efforts, young blacks continued to force library integration, seldom received national media attention. Nonetheless, by the end of 1963, they'd largely desegregated most public libraries in the urban South. Not so in rural small towns. In rural Louisiana, the Congress on Racial Equality, or CORE, determined to use public libraries to test the new Civil Rights Act. Local black youth would be the testers. A series of incidents that brought most attention to library desegregation in Louisiana's rural parishes occurred in the St. Helena and the East and West Feliciana parishes. As late as 1964, black people living in this area could not access the library building. Instead, their only access to public library books was a blue bookmobile. A red bookmobile was reserved for whites only. Both were supported by federal funds through the state library agency. When white residents applied for a library card, they received a red one, no doubt to match their red bookmobile. When blacks registered for a library card, at the blue bookmobile, the only place they could register and the only place they could retrieve and return a book, they received a blue library card with the word Negro stamped on it. On March 7, 4 St. Helena Parish black teenagers approached the Greensburg branch of the Audubon Regional Library System. The librarians saw them coming, recognized what was happening, immediately locked the door, and posted closed signs in the window. The group left. The street was crowded with Negroes and whites, a Corps observer reported. The majority of the merchants was standing on the sidewalk talking with spectators. The sheriff could not be found anywhere. 4 days later, the youths returned and met the same response. Through the window, the group saw the librarian make a phone call. Moments later, she unlocked the door, came out, relocked it, and walked across the street to the pharmacy. Now, this evidence comes from the affidavits that the testers, the young black kids, wrote up after these incidents, and it's got raw language. Now, you all know what MF means in modern parlance. If I say FN, you should know what that means too. On a third attempt on March 13, the 4 teenage boys decided to pair off rather than approach as a foursome. As 2 walked in front of the drugstore across the street, the pharmacist came out and said, "I'm sorry, boys, but you're too late. Come back tomorrow and you may have better luck." As they left, however, he sneered, "I wish you FNs would come to my place." When the pair crossed the street to meet the other 2 who were approaching from a different direction, they learned it was again locked against them. Then they walked to the courthouse and without incident drank from the white water fountain. They returned to the drugstore for some ice cream, where the pharmacist met them at the front door. "I'm tired of fooling with you FNs," she shouted, and he pulled out a handgun. "Get away from here, and I don't mean maybe." The youths fled. On a 4th attempt 3 days later, they came back despite seeing that gun. The group again found the library closed. They walked into the courthouse where they drank from the white water fountain. This time, however, the white janitor grabbed one of the boys and shouted, "There's a fountain over there for the ends, and if you FNs can't drink from that fountain, get out of here and don't be caught back in here no more." He then called for help from a friend upstairs. "Come down here and help me get these FNs out of here." When the group walked to the courthouse front steps, the janitor went to a closet for a lead pipe and ran to the front door. "If you FNs come back here again, I'll kill every one of you." At that point, he struck one of the boys with a pipe. The boy was taken to a local hospital, treated, and released. Days later, Corps organized a selective buying campaign against the pharmacist. On March 7, 4 black teenagers approached the public library in St. Francisville, where no black citizens had registered to vote for 61 years. When some made the attempt to register earlier that year, they were met at the courthouse by a mob of white men armed with guns and knives. Later that week, night riders shot at the homes of several, and 2 were beaten with a rifle butt. But the teenage library testers had been well trained. For the past 2 weeks, Corps had been preparing the young people and community leaders for the upcoming library action. If arrested, participants pledged to stay in jail until their trials and prepared for their ordeals by conducting sociodramas and discussing nonviolence. Post-arrest plans included a prayer vigil in front of the jail and a stepped-up boycott. In St. Francisville, the library had been open the morning of the proposed sit-in, but it closed at noon, so the group abandoned their plan. Instead, after consulting the organizers, the teenagers drove to East Feliciana, where that library remained open. The local sheriff had been notified that morning there might be trouble. All morning he waited and finally saw 5 students enter the library. With 4 of his friends, Clinton resident Henry Brown walked in, apparently the first blacks ever to do so. As soon as he observed the students, the sheriff called his deputies. In the meantime, Brown requested 2 books. One, a copy of the U.S. Constitution, the other, a story of the Negro, a children's textbook. The branch assistant checked the card catalog for the latter, told Brown that the branch library didn't have it, but she'd order it from the state library and that it would either be mailed to him or he could retrieve it from the blue bookmobile. Shortly thereafter, the assistant asked the 5 to leave. When they didn't, she called in the regional librarian, who issued the same order. The youths remained, Brown sitting at the table and others standing near him, doing and saying nothing. 5 minutes later, the sheriff and his deputies approached them and ordered them to leave under threat of arrest. When they refused, they were all arrested, taken to jail, and charged with disturbing the peace. While in jail, Henry Brown received the copy of the Constitution he'd requested, but with it came instructions that he return the book in person to the Blue Bookmobile or mail it back to the East Feliciana Public Library. At their trial, the 5 black youths were found guilty of disturbing the peace. Henry Brown received a sentence of $150 or 90 days in jail. The others were assessed a fine of $35 or 15 days in jail. At the trial, however, the librarian of the Audubon Regional Library System surprised everyone by announcing, Negroes are allowed to use the library if they are citizens of one of the 3 parishes. But use had taken on a new meaning. A week after the trial, all 3 of the initially targeted Audubon regional libraries closed their doors, claiming they intended to cut costs and at the same time improve library services through a telephone reference and request service. The new rules provided a patron can now dial a special library number at no charge. Reference questions are answered immediately or by return call. Books are mailed or sent by bookmobile. If users wish to browse, they were required to do so when the bookmobile arrived in their area every few weeks. Black people still had to use the blue bookmobile, white people the red bookmobile. The plan was so bizarre, CORE hoped adverse reaction would be enough to open the branches up again. And some in the white community did complain. One resident observed, it was so strange that no one had ever heard of the plan before now, and the announcement came so soon after the attempt to integrate services there. Later, the city's attorney revealed that the white women who staffed the branch libraries were just too scared to work in there once the demonstrations began. While the newspaper reported these events, the librarian's regular weekly newspaper column carried no mention of them. Instead, she kept reporting on interesting books that had just arrived at the library. Henry Brown and his 4 co-defendants appealed their conviction, and Brown versus the Board of Louisiana eventually worked its way to the Supreme Court, which overturned the convictions in a 5-4 decision on February 23, 1966. It is a sad commentary that this hallowed place bore the ugly stamp of racism, said Justice Abe Fortas, who wrote the majority opinion, and who, as a Memphis Jewish teenager in the 1920s, not only experienced many of the local WASP culture's anti-Semitic practices, but also used the public library and observed its treatment of black people that Richard Wright so eloquently described in quotations given at the beginning of this presentation. By 1965, public libraries in the South were no longer primary targets of demonstrations, sit-ins, and read-ins. When, for example, civil rights activists announced a 3-month campaign in Bessemer, Alabama in June and targeted the public library as its first site, they met no opposition. As demonstrators approached the circulation desk, the librarian registered them for borrowers' cards without resistance and calmly explained library rules and regulations. Before the end of the decade, racially separate state library organizations no longer existed, and by 1972, 90% of people, black and white, living in the Deep South lived in public library service areas. The goal of integrating Southern public libraries had been accomplished, but not without much pain, anguish, and danger. The stories Shirley and I tell in the Desegregation of Public Libraries in the Jim Crow South are an undeniable part of Southern civil rights and library history. We hope we do an adequate job of filling the knowledge gap in Southern and civil rights historical literature. As for library history, our purpose is broader. Several years ago, when we told a couple of colleagues from other institutions in the South that we were working on this book, one asked, "You mean Southern public libraries were segregated at one time?" Another wanted us to lecture to his intellectual freedom class about the heroic defense librarians put up against segregated services. Both had absorbed professional myths and assumed that the librarianship's 21st century rhetoric about opposing censorship, defending intellectual freedom, and offering neutral services to all people characterized its entire history. Although librarianship has moved away from the 1960s chronologically, the story we tell here must become part of the profession's collective memory. Without coming to grips with a history that portrays both halos and warts, librarianship will always have difficulty seeing the limits of its professional abilities. Throughout the period described here, the American Library Association filed no amicus brief on behalf of plaintiffs in any case involving the integration of public libraries. At the same time, however, it continued to welcome into membership all libraries, including those that discriminated against black people. Our book shows that during the desegregation of the South's Jim Crow public libraries, ALA and scores of state library associations did little to address the unmerited suffering of young black people who ask only that their public library live up to its ideals. Thank you. Do we have Reverend Dr. Frederick Taylor in the audience? There you go. Dr. Taylor, would you come up? Dr. Taylor, as a 17-year-old? Okay. Walked in with a number of other students to the Columbus, Georgia Public Library. Pardon me? Oh, you're Montgomery. I'm sorry. I was thinking of Cleophas Tyson. Come up, Cleophas, okay? Yes. The Reverend Dr. Taylor was at the Montgomery Public Library, and these two protesters have met themselves for the first time. Up the ramp, yeah. And we're very glad they're here this evening to share some of their experiences, because I didn't cover the Columbus, Georgia Public Library or the Montgomery Public Library in my talk, although we do cover it in our book. Okay. It is a pleasure, sir. All right. So I'm going to ask each of you to share your experiences for 5 minutes or so, okay. And then we can open it up to questions and answers.
Yeah, okay. My name is Cleophas Tyson, originally from Columbus, Georgia. In 1963, summer of 1963, we were approached at a little corner store by some NAACP field secretaries from Savannah State College. They told us about a mass meeting that we were going to have and down at the Masonic Temple downtown. So I was interested, so we went down. I went down and we discussed civil rights movements and planning on what our next move would be. So we thought maybe the library would be the best target for desegregation, starting this desegregating process in the city. Okay, it was the Bradley Library that we went, and as we went in and sat down, we were asked to leave by the librarian, and we didn't leave, so next the police came in and they asked us to leave, so we didn't leave. So they arrested us, and it was about 9 of us, I think, and we went to jail, and somebody bailed us out. Somebody called the anonymous donor, who was supposedly W. Woodworth, one of the Woodworth Coca-Cola guys. He was a undercover liberal, and he would always get us out of jail. They would call us the anonymous donor. So we never got summoned to go to court. They just forgot about it. They didn't want us to go to court. We was trying to make a court date, but that wasn't coming because they knew if they had a court date, they would have to make a decision, a court decision, and they didn't want to do that. So eventually, after we went down, got out of jail, went back the next day, they sent some more people to jail. I don't think I was in that rush. But anyway, eventually they stopped arresting us and never made a official announcement that the libraries were integrated. It was just so. It was just that they didn't bother you anymore for coming in there. So we left that and went to the parks and pools, recreation centers, and so forth and so on. But if you could ask anyone in Columbus, Georgia, especially the news people, they would tell you that it didn't happen. It's like a lie by omission. That they forgot it happened. Not that I want any credit for it. I don't care. But I'm just saying, I wouldn't want my children to be taught a lie. Just like the Maroons and the Gullah warriors back in slavery, they never gave us credit for fighting for our own freedom. They give account of the white man and the abolitionists. Abolitionists and Lincoln gave us a gift of freedom. They never give account of us dying and fighting for our own freedom. And it's the same way it is now in that situation where Columbus, Georgia won't have that on them. It's nice to say that it went smoothly and it was nice and it was, but it wasn't. It wasn't so. It was violence involved. It was a lot of hostility and nasty talking, even putting people in jail, and all of that went on. But it's not documented in our city's history, for some reason. Thank you.
You're welcome. Dr. Kelp?
Thank you very much. When I got the call about you going to be here, Doctor, doing this presentation on desegregation of public libraries, the brother who called me from this library made mention of the fact that they had heard about my participation in the desegregation of Montgomery Public Library. Now that's been about 64, 65, more than 50 years ago. And as I think about it, Montgomery is famous for the Montgomery bus boycott. Around about 64, I was a junior in college, and black people were still automatically going to the back of the bus, although the buses had been desegregated in early 1956. So a group of students, we took on two projects. One was to ride the buses on predominantly white routes and intentionally sit in the front of the bus. And as some black riders got on, they would motion for us to come back to the back of the bus. But we continued to sit in an attempt to sensitize or to say to black people, we no longer had to go to the back of the bus. Another project we took on was the desegregation of the public library in Montgomery, Alabama. As I recall, a lawyer in Montgomery by the name of Charles Conley talked with three of us, myself, Captain James, and a black brother by the name of Arthur Hale. It was decided that we would go to the public library. I went to the philosophy shelves, because I was interested in philosophy. I got a couple of books, went to the desk. They said that the librarian said, you can't check out in the books. You cannot use this library. You have to go to the colored library. I left. We left. We went to Attorney Charles Conley's office that same day. He eventually filed a lawsuit in Judge Frank M. Johnson, the district federal judge in Montgomery, Alabama, Frank M. Johnson. We went to trial. I remember the two other plaintiffs testified. We went and they refused to let us check out the book. By the time I got on the stand to testify, Attorney Conley asking me the same questions. What did you do? You went to and they refused to allow you to check out the books. And so the judge took the case. He did not rule on that day, but subsequently, Judge Frank M. Johnson ruled that for the desegregation of the public libraries in the city of Montgomery, Alabama. I might mention the fact that Judge Frank M. Johnson was also a law student in law school at the University of Alabama at the same time George Corley Wallace was in law school at the University of Alabama. President Dwight Eisenhower appointed him to the district judge in Montgomery, but we all know the history of where George Wallace ended up standing in the schoolhouse door. So that's my story.
So we'll take some questions, but in advance of the questions, I want you all to know that one of Mr. Tyson's colleagues, Charlie Porter, who is now Ibrahim Muchman and an activist in Washington, D.C., went to the Columbus, Georgia Public Library a couple of years ago and said, where is the record of these activities? And he got angry enough that it stuck in his mind, and when he heard the publicity about this book, he called me. And so together, it looks like we're going to have some event in either January of October or of February of next year at which the Columbus, Georgia Public Library will recognize this history. Hopefully, somebody will do a more in-depth one. And I'll even, Dr. Taylor, Montgomery, Alabama, May 4th, I think you and I are in a panel if you're going to be coming. And Montgomery, Alabama is going to be doing this. And all of you, I would recommend, take a look on the internet by simply Googling Joseph Jackson, Rachel Maddow. It is a segment in which Rachel Maddow covers the erection of a plaque in front of the Jacksonville Public Library thanking the Tougaloo Nine for their contribution to the local community. And my hope is that I go across the Deep South bringing some profile to these heretofore forgotten events, that the public libraries will take some action and remember the kids who risked their lives to desegregate public libraries, which are supposed to be free to all. Okay, questions and answers?
I just wanted to make a comment. I'm really am impressed with you as far as the people in Montgomery. And in those days, you were the starters. It was no civil rights movement. It was not even a thought of it. These guys here from Montgomery, Alabama, these country boys from Montgomery, Alabama, I'm serious, stuck together. The guys stuck together and walked to work rather than catch the bus and boycotted that bus. I worked on the railroad back and forth to Montgomery, and I know a lot of you guys down there.
I got you.
Yeah.
Right. Full disclosure, after I finished Alabama State College in '65, I came to Atlanta. I went to seminary at ITC. I graduated in 1969, May of '69, and I started working at SCLC down the street in 1969. And I retired from SCLC in 2007. So my whole professional, quote, career or work was done at the SCLC. I came on board 1 year after the assassination of Dr. King. And also, for disclosure, in 1955, I was 13 years old during the Montgomery bus boycott, and I passed out leaflets to publicize the weekly mass meeting that took place during those 381 days. Just full disclosure. So that's my story.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so you said there was no national movement, there was no civil rights, there was no national movement. So all of these different things were happening on local levels, like each state, each city that was, trying to integrate the libraries were all happening individually?
No, first, it's like I said, there was no talk, really, or no major effort, I say it that way, for integrating anything, any kind of civil rights movement, any kind of Martin Luther King, none of that before the Montgomery boycott. This was the first time that blacks stood up in a unity, in a unified manner, to started the civil rights movement. That was in maybe 62, what year, 62 maybe? 60.
Boycott was in 1955.
55, 56, right.
December 1 and it
Right.
ended.
Right,
well,
that was the first.
381 days.
That was the first.
So when he was giving the presentation in the different states and different cities that was, like in Birmingham, the other places, there was no organized leadership coming from any national organization.
Yes, yeah, well, you had the NAACP, you had SNCC, which you had CORE, you had SCLC. These were national organizations, black organizations. Well, the NAACP was actually white. It had white head office, but you had 5 organizations that I knew of that were pretty active nationally. Yeah.
I think in Montgomery, Montgomery was famous for the bus boycott, but those of us who were there by 65, 63, 60, Reverend, I've been, Martin Luther King was the first president of MIA, SSA, and Amy Zion Preacher was the second president, Jesse Douglas. But by 64, Mrs. Johnny Carr was the president of the MIA, and it became the interest or the motivation, particularly the students at Alabama State, primarily because in '65 we had the conclusion of the Selma to Montgomery March, which, but getting back to the library situation, I don't recall the leadership of the civil rights movement it just did not reach the agenda, I would think. But those who took up the mantle, we were encouraged and supported.
If my reading of history is any indication, none of the major organizations spearheaded
That's right.
public library demonstrations, except in rural Louisiana. CORE took that on. But they all came in the wake of this kind of spontaneous reaction. I'll give you the Hattiesburg, I was in Hattiesburg last night, the Hattiesburg example. It was kids between the ages of 9 and 17 who came from the freedom schools during Freedom Summer, who were being introduced to books at the libraries that the freedom schools had, and saying, why can't we get these books at the Hattiesburg Public Library? And the kids would then say to their teachers, most of whom were white, having come down from New England and the mid-Atlantic states, why can't we do this? And the teachers would say, I don't know, and automatically they sort of went down to the Hattiesburg Public Library and sat there and closed the place down.
Well, now, my experience in Columbus, Georgia, they never, I lost my thought. They never really, I lost my thought. But they never got really started pumping the civil rights movement in the summer of '62, '63. And there was, yeah, I got it. The young people, the older people, they had the NAACP adult branch, which is headed by preachers and older people that I call Uncle Toms. Really what they were, real Uncle Tom. They were worse than some of the white people. And they were all handled by, you see, they chose our leaders back then. You said, well, you know, you own a funeral home, you're a pretty good old boy, so you're going to be the president of the NAACP, you know? And that's what you were, you know? And they were contained. The older people, my parents along with them had to keep their job. They had to work somewhere, you know, and they couldn't do what we did. But they got my parents got a lot of pressure from the economy to make me shut my mouth, but it didn't happen. My daddy had to leave Columbus to go get a job to take care of us, even though he was retired military, but he still had to get work, you know, do something. But it was all the young people. It was the older people, they were just stagnant. They would just listen to.
Yes, ma'am. Red dress?
Actually, two questions. My last this question, the first one, which was, I know access was the problem, was part of the problem when it came to trying to get some of the books that the children wanted to read or interact with. But what, I can only imagine the condition of the building and the collection itself might have been. So you entertain my thoughts. What were you getting books, the pages were torn out? Was it an older edition? Was the word nigger thrown about in the book? If I went in there today, what would I see? Because even some people here in this 21st century would say, perhaps on certain libraries, well, we don't have the latest books. We don't have working computers. Well, computers, not in that instance, but,
Right.
you know, what did it look like? What did a desegregated library look like?
Okay, my experience in Columbus, Georgia, we always had a pretty wealthy county. They had money, you know. There wasn't no shortage of money in that county, Muscogee County. But they would build the blacks beautiful buildings. The Fourth Avenue Library was nice. It was, I mean, riding by, it was nice. And the schools were ultra modern looking, nice. Carver High School, real nice. Spencer High School, nice looking school. But there wasn't nothing in them. It was empty. I mean, all of the books had somebody else's name written in them. Twice, maybe 2-3 times. You know, we had these books, but they were used and worn out before we got a hold to them. Even in the library, if you asked for a book, they would get it to you in a couple of days, next week. But as far as you going there in the Fourth Avenue Library and just having access to a decent collection or something, no. But it's a beautiful building. I always had a beautiful building. But that's how they were fooled.